Hello and welcome. My name's Shannon and I'm so excited to have you join me here today as I upcycle a vintage picnic basket. My husband and I were talking recently about going on a picnic and I realized I didn't have a picnic basket, and it's something I've always wanted. Even though he's okay with taking the cooler down there and having the picnic out of that, I wanted something a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. So I started looking online and there were a lot of options, but nothing that really suited my style. And this is where it can be really fun. We can personalize our own picnic basket. So I went to Etsy and I found lots of picnic baskets to choose from, all vintage. And this one really jumped out at me. Let me show you why. First off, I absolutely love the color of the wicker. It needs a lot of work. It's definitely been well loved. We need to do some repairing on the side with the wicker. On the inside, you can see that it has that typical red and white checkerboard pattern. There's a couple stains. This definitely needs to come out. We need to realign this. I'm going to be replacing the chains here. And I like the idea of this strap, but I think we might update this. And that way, if you don't want to use the handle, you can just throw it over your shoulder, which I really like that option. I really want this to be a wine and cheese basket in the end. So I'm planning on creating a couple of accessories that are going to go on the inside. One of them being a cheese board, a custom cheese board, and maybe some matching napkins. Maybe we can order some vintage glassware to go on the inside as well and just make it really fun. I think we're going to do maybe a matching wine bag just to make it all kind of cohesive on the inside. I really hope that you're just as excited as I am to take this journey with me, and maybe in the end you can join us on our picnic. All right, let's get started.
The first step was to dismember and clean the picnic basket. I could see that the lining was held in place by fishing wire, which was going to be easy to remove. I was happy to discover that nothing was glued to the wicker, though that's exactly what I plan on doing when I put everything back together. I gutted all the musty old fabric and kept it aside for when I cut the new fabric lining. It would be a great template to work with, as the previous owner already had the lining perfectly measured and sewn together. I removed the rusty chains by using some pliers and a metal cutting tool that my husband had in the garage. I did decide to leave the carrying strap on the basket for the time being, since I'm not 100% convinced on changing that out just yet. Once I started to clean the basket with mild dish soap and warm water, I discovered that not only the dirt was coming off, but the stain was also being removed. I started to get really discouraged since I loved the color of the basket so much. But when doing these kind of projects with vintage things, you have to be fully prepared to problem solve. So I had two options. I could either embrace the worn look after I fully cleaned the basket, or I could apply some stain. Luckily, my husband had some of the exact stain I needed, and I was able to apply 2 coats. I also have a few places where the wicker was broken, so I used mini dowel rods that I picked up at my local craft store and super glued them to spots where they were needed. Once the stain was applied, you couldn't even tell they weren't part of the wicker. I also realized as I was outside working that it was the first day of fall, and it was an absolutely beautiful day. You could just smell autumn in the air. I finished the second coat and was extremely happy with how this turned out, despite it not being part of the original plan. Now that I'm done staining, I'm going to change into my pajamas, grab a cup of coffee, and get started on sewing and embroidering the matching napkins and wine bag. Once I had my cup of coffee, I got to work. I just want to let you all know that I'm not a professional when it comes to sewing. I'm actually not a professional at a lot of what I do, but I just try to learn and do new things all the time. And I encourage you all to do the same. And with practice, you'll only get better at the things you love. I started the napkins by measuring 2 squares that were 22 by 22 inches so that I could do a 1-inch double fold hem. In the end, this will give me an 18 by 18 inch square napkin. I'm using linen fabric, but there are other options if you don't care for the linen material. and I always take my time at this part, cutting as straight as possible, since this will make hemming much easier. Once my squares were cut and ready to work with, I moved over to my ironing board and prepared myself to stab the fabric multiple times with pins to keep the hem in place. This was the first time I tried to do mitered corners. If you search the internet on how to execute these, you'll find a plethora of blogs, videos, tutorials, and that's exactly how I figured it out. Plus, I did have the seam rip a few times and start over. Mine might not be perfect, but hey, I did it. I folded over each hem, ironed and pinned them in place, and made sure to take my time as I went. On a side note, there's a tool available called a sliding gauge that will help give you the exact 1-inch even hem, but I always take the hard route and I just measured different areas to make sure I was at the 1-inch mark that I needed. There are a few tools that I can't sew without. First would be a seam ripper for the inevitable mistakes. We all make them. Next is my water erasable pen and a good pair of fabric scissors. The water erasable pen is wonderful because you can draw all over the fabric, and then once you submerge it in water, the ink disappears. And be sure to only use your fabric scissors for fabric. I have to admit that the corners did frustrate me until I really understood how they worked. Once I did about 3 of them, they became much easier, and they give such a clean look once you turn them right side out. When you finish your corners, you can move on to hemming around the entire napkin. And this is what your finished product should look like. Next was to start cutting the wine bag. There'd be no sewing on the bag this night because I will need to embroider it before I layer it and sew it all back together. I measured 4 pieces of fabric that I cut to 18 by 7 inches each. Once I'm done with the embroidery, I will sew the layers together while allowing a place for a drawstring. Now the next part is always my favorite, designing the embroidery. I do this with my water erasable pen, and I almost always just make a scribbled mess. But this gives me my outline to start embroidering. I know ants are usually associated with picnic baskets, but I like the idea of spiders instead. 'Tis the season, and well, my personality. I taught myself to embroider by watching videos or reading blogs. I still don't know if I'm doing everything correctly, and sometimes I have to rip everything out and start over, but it's always worth it in the end. I'm using an embroidery hoop and some brown and blue embroidery thread for the napkins, and then I added some green, peach, and black thread for the wine bag. I noticed as I completed the napkins that they needed something a little extra. So I went to my lace stash and started to hand stitch lace around the edges, and I love how it turned out. It was just what they needed. I rinsed both the wine bag and the napkins underwater to clean off the water erasable pen, and then let them dry overnight. The next day I ironed them and drew some sewing lines on the panels of the wine bag. There can be so many steps to sewing projects. You measure, draw your sewing lines, iron, sew, iron the hems, go back to sewing, and it goes on and on like that. There's a lot of steps to this wine bag, though it's not complicated. I found the pattern just by Googling DIY reusable wine bags, and they'd make for wonderful gifts too for family or friends. Basically, you're just creating 2 bags that will fit inside one another. It gives a really nice, clean, finished look to the whole bag. Once all the sewing was completed, I used a safety pin to pull the drawstring through, added some wooden beads, and unraveled the ends to make them look more like tassels. And now that the napkins and the wine bag are complete, it's on to creating the cheese board. I chose pine for my cheese board because it's extremely easy to cut and sand. With that being said, it's also a very soft wood, so I would not recommend it for a cutting board. I'm strictly using mine to display food during my picnics. I cut my board, then used a Dremel to sand and round the edges. Next, I lightly sanded it with fine grit sandpaper. Once I was happy with how the board looked, I moved on to burning my design into the wood. I'm new at using a wood burning tool, and I found it to be pretty time consuming, but I think the more I use it, the more comfortable I will be with it. I then used butcher block oil and finish, which is safe for food contact. I applied 2 coats and it was ready to use within 72 hours. Now that the cheese board has been completed, I moved on to reconstructing the basket. I truly felt like it took me forever to get to this point, and there's a lot of steps here, so I'll try to sum it up as best as possible. It took me 2 full days to fully put this back together. To start, when I cut the cheese board, I also cut a piece of wood for the lid of my basket. I used Mod Podge to glue the fabric into place and then left it to dry. I used the old fabric from the basket as a template to cut the new lining for the lower portion, and I also made sure to cut the same template out of felt. I wanted to do a thick lining out of the felt because I wanted to be sure that when looking from the outside of the basket, you couldn't see any of the backside of the fabric lining through the wicker. I pinned and sewed along the sides so that it would easily fit inside the basket, and then I could use fishing line to attach it to the wicker. Yep, I said fishing line. I said at the start of the project I was going to use glue, and I couldn't understand why they used fishing line, but as I started to put the basket back together, I realized why. It had been the best way to attach the fabric, hold everything in place, and keep the wicker in good shape. I also decided on a pocket for the lid. I went back and forth on this for some time, but finally went for it, and I'm so happy that I did. I used elastic to make sure it would hold whatever I put in there in place. I used glue sticks and Mod Podge for this, along with a lot of sewing. I added the lace so that you couldn't see any of the fishing line that was helping hold on the wood board to the lid. I then added a brown piece of felt to the back to finish it off. I replaced the chains and then I slid the lining inside and sewed it to the wicker along the top, bottom, and corners. This took a long time, but I always listen to music to pass the time. I actually started to listen to crime podcasts and I'm absolutely hooked. To finish up the basket, I added 2 ties on each side to keep the wine glasses held in place. So, it's done. The basket is finished and we can go on our picnic. Just in time to enjoy all the fall leaves. My husband and I are so excited. Would you care to join us?
The basket is now complete, and I am so happy with how it turned out. My husband and I are so happy you're able to join us on our picnic today. I actually just started a Patreon page. I'll link it below. Please feel free to check it out and see if that would be something that you would like to support. I will put in some behind the scenes content. I'm hoping to get something new every month out to you guys, and it's just going to be a place where we can really interact and talk about art and some of the projects that are going to be coming up. So again, thank you guys. I really hope you enjoyed this, and I'm going to finish some of this wine because he doesn't seem to want any.